The morning sun cast long shadows across Bagram Airfield as Staff Sergeant Maya Torres completed her pre-flight inspection of the C-130J Super Hercules. At 28 years old, she had the quiet confidence of someone who had earned every stripe on her sleeve the hard way. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her flight suit bore the patches of the 774th Expeditionary Airlift Squadron. Maya ran her hand along the aircraft's fuselage, a ritual she performed before every mission. The metal was cold, solid, reassuring. "Talking to your boyfriend again, Torres." Technical Sergeant Marcus Webb called out from the cargo ramp, his Alabama accent thick as molasses. At 35, Webb was a veteran flight engineer with over 3,000 hours in the C-130, and he'd taken Maya under his wing when she'd arrived in Afghanistan 6 months earlier. Maya grinned. "She's a lady, Webb. Show some respect." She climbed aboard, breathing in the familiar smell of hydraulic fluid, metal, and the faint trace of jet fuel that seemed to permeate every military aircraft she'd ever known. Today's mission was straightforward: transport medical supplies and a team of Army medics to Forward Operating Base Chapman, a remote outpost nestled in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan. It was the kind of milk run they'd flown dozens of times. Inside the cockpit, Captain Derek Holloway was running through the pre-flight checklist with his co-pilot, First Lieutenant James Chen. Holloway, 34, was a Texas native with 15 years in the Air Force and a reputation as one of the best C-130 pilots in theater. Chen, at 26, was newer but sharp, with reflexes that had earned him top marks in flight school. They worked together with the easy rhythm of a crew that had logged hundreds of hours together. "Torres, you secure back there," Holloway's voice crackled through the intercom. Maya surveyed the cargo hold. The medical supplies were strapped down with precision: boxes of bandages, antibiotics, IV fluids, surgical equipment, everything a Forward Operating Base needed to treat wounded soldiers. She'd triple-checked every restraint, every tie-down point. 6 Army medics were already seated along the web seating, checking their personal equipment. "Cargo secure, sir. We're green." "Outstanding. Webb, how are my engines looking?" "All 4 spinning like butter churns at a county fair, Captain. We're good to go." As the C-130's engines roared to life, Maya settled into her jump seat near the crew door. This was her domain, the cargo hold. As a loadmaster, she was responsible for everything that went into and came out of this aircraft. It was a job that required meticulous attention to detail, physical strength, and the ability to stay calm when things went sideways. She excelled at all 3. What most of her crew didn't know, what she rarely talked about, was that 5 years earlier she'd been on a different path. Maya had been a pilot trainee, top of her class at initial flight training at Joint Base San Antonio, with dreams of flying fighters or heavy transports. She'd aced every test, every simulator session, every flight evaluation. Her instructors had called her a natural, praising her smooth hands on the controls and her instinctive feel for aircraft. Then, during her T-6 Texan II training at Columbus Air Force Base, she'd experienced a series of severe migraines that grounded her. The flight surgeons ran every test imaginable and diagnosed a vascular condition, a minor malformation in the blood vessels near her brain that could, under the stress of high-G maneuvers or rapid altitude changes, cause debilitating headaches or worse. The condition wasn't life-threatening, but it was disqualifying. Her dream had died in a sterile medical office, ended by something she couldn't control, couldn't fight, couldn't overcome with determination or skill. She'd cried for 3 days straight. Then she'd made a decision. If she couldn't fly aircraft, she'd at least work on them, in them, around them. She'd requested a transfer to loadmaster training, determined to stay in the air somehow. In the years since, she'd thrown herself into her new role with the same intensity she'd brought to pilot training. She became the best loadmaster in her unit, known for her precision, her attention to detail, and her uncanny ability to calculate weight and balance distributions in her head. But the ache of what might have been never fully disappeared. She kept up her civilian pilot's license, flying whenever she had leave, renting Cessnas and Pipers at civilian airports, logging hours for reasons she couldn't quite articulate. Maybe it was hope that someday the medical condition would resolve. Maybe it was just the need to keep that part of herself alive. Whatever the reason, she'd accumulated nearly 200 hours of civilian flight time in the 5 years since her washout. The C-130 lifted off smoothly, banking east toward the mountains. Through the small window near her station, Maya watched the sprawling base fall away, replaced by the rugged, unforgiving terrain of Afghanistan. The Hindu Kush mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still capped with snow despite the summer heat. This was her 73rd mission since arriving in country, and the view never got old, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. "Hey, Nighthawk," one of the medics called out, using her call sign. Specialist Rodriguez was a stocky kid from Miami, barely 22, with an easy smile and the enthusiasm of someone on their first deployment. "Tell us again how you got that name." Maya had heard this request a dozen times, but she never minded retelling the story. It was one of the few good memories from her time in pilot training. It was during survival training at Fairchild Air Force Base in Washington. We had to do a night navigation exercise, just a map, compass, and a red flashlight. We were supposed to find 6 checkpoints scattered across about 10 miles of dense forest. Most people got lost or took twice as long as they should have. I made it to every checkpoint, first in my group, barely used the flashlight at all. My instructors started calling me Nighthawk because they said I could navigate in the dark like a hawk hunting at night. "That's it," Rodriguez looked disappointed. "I thought it would be more exciting, like you wrestled a bear or something." Webb laughed from his position near the flight engineer's station. "Kid, in the military, the best call signs come from either being exceptionally good at something or spectacularly screwing up. Be Grateful Tours got hers the first way. You don't want to know how some of the other guys in the squadron earned theirs." "What's yours, Sergeant Webb?" asked Sergeant First Class Williams, one of the senior medics. She was on her 3rd deployment, a no-nonsense professional from Atlanta with a daughter starting college. "They call me Clutch," Webb said with a grin. "Because during my first deployment in Iraq, we had an engine failure on takeoff. I managed to restart it mid-flight while we were still climbing. Captain said I came through in the clutch." The flight leveled off at 22,000 feet, and the conversation shifted to the usual deployment topics: food, mail from home, how many days until leave. In the cockpit, Holloway and Chen monitored their instruments while exchanging small talk about families back home. Holloway's wife was expecting their 2nd child in 3 months. Chen's fiancé was planning their wedding for when he returned stateside. The weather report had mentioned some turbulence ahead, but nothing unusual for mountain flying. Standard afternoon thermal activity over the peaks, maybe some wind shear in the valleys. Holloway had flown this route so many times he could practically do it with his eyes closed. Everything was routine, comfortable, exactly as it should be. Maya unstrapped from her seat and began her in-flight checks, ensuring the cargo restraints remained secure despite the slight turbulence. She chatted with the medics, learning that Rodriguez's first deployment was everything he'd hoped for: exciting but not too dangerous so far. Williams shared photos of her daughter's graduation. Captain Myers, the senior medical officer, was quiet, focused on reading a medical journal he'd brought along. The aircraft hit a patch of rough air, bouncing hard enough that Maya had to grab a cargo strap for balance. "Little bumpy today," she called forward to Webb. "Just mountain waves," Webb replied. "Nothing this old girl can't handle. We'll be through it in about 15 minutes. Maya returned to her seat and strapped in, watching the mountain slide past below. She'd learned to read the terrain from the air, understanding how the valleys funneled wind, how the peaks created turbulence, how the whole massive landscape affected the aircraft's flight. It was knowledge born from hundreds of hours in the air, watching, learning, absorbing everything she could about aviation, even from the cargo hold. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, A final text from her sister before they moved out of cell range. "Stay safe up there, Maya. Love you." She typed back a quick reply. "Always do. Love you too." Then she tucked the phone away and settled back, letting the familiar vibration of the engines and the gentle rocking of the aircraft relax her. In 90 minutes, they'd be on the ground at Chapman, offloading supplies, maybe grabbing a quick meal before the return flight. Then back to Bagram by dinner, maybe catch a movie in the rec room, write some emails home. Tomorrow would bring another mission, another flight, another day in the routine that had become her life. Maya closed her eyes for just a moment, letting herself imagine what it would be like to be sitting up front in that left seat, hands on the controls, making the decisions, feeling the aircraft respond to her inputs. It was a fantasy she indulged occasionally, harmless dreaming about a life that would never be hers. She had no way of knowing that in less than 10 minutes, that fantasy would become a terrifying reality, and everything she'd learned in 5 years of lost dreams would be put to the ultimate test. The first sign of trouble came as a weather update crackled through the cockpit speakers. "Reach 447, this is Bagram approach. Be advised, moderate turbulence reported ahead at your altitude. Recommend reducing speed and ensuring all personnel are secured." "Copy that, Bagram," Holloway replied, his voice calm and professional. He keyed the intercom. "Everyone strap in back there. We've got some bumpy air coming up." Maya had already secured herself in the jump seat, watching the 6 Army medics do the same. She'd flown through turbulence countless times. It was an unavoidable part of flying over mountains. The aircraft could handle far worse than what they were about to encounter. The turbulence hit moments later, the aircraft bucking and shuddering as they entered a rough patch of air created by thermal currents rising off the sun-heated peaks below. The C-130 dropped suddenly, Maya's stomach lurching as they fell what felt like 100 feet in seconds, then just as quickly rose again. It was uncomfortable but not dangerous, just nature reminding them that the sky wasn't always a smooth highway. "Moderate my ass," Chen muttered in the cockpit, fighting to keep the aircraft steady. "This is severe." "Welcome to mountain flying," Holloway said with a slight grin. "Just keep her." Then came a sound Maya would never forget, an explosive crack followed by a deafening roar of wind that seemed to tear through the entire aircraft. The sound was so sudden, so violent, that for a split second her mind couldn't process what had happened. Then the screaming started in the cockpit. A massive flock of griffin vultures had risen from a thermal current directly into their flight path, dozens of the huge birds, each weighing 15 to 20 pounds, their wings spanning nearly 9 feet. The birds had no time to scatter. The C-130, traveling at over 200 knots, had no time to evade. One bird, a massive male griffin vulture, smashed through the left cockpit window like a missile fired from point-blank range. The impact was catastrophic. The reinforced plexiglass window, designed to withstand bird strikes from smaller birds, shattered under the force of the 20-pound vulture hitting at 230 miles per hour. Shards of reinforced plexiglass exploded through the flight deck like a fragmentation grenade, each piece a razor-sharp projectile moving at lethal velocity. Captain Holloway took the brunt of it. A large fragment, nearly 6 inches across and jagged as broken glass, struck his left temple with devastating force. The impact was so severe that his flight helmet cracked, and he slumped forward instantly against his harness, blood pouring from a deep gash that ran from his eyebrow to his hairline. His hands fell away from the controls, lifeless. Lieutenant Chen, sitting in the right seat just 3 feet away, caught multiple lacerations across the right side of his face and his right arm. Blood sprayed across the instrument panel as a particularly sharp fragment sliced through his flight suit and into the muscles of his forearm. Another piece caught him just below the right eye, missing the eye itself by less than an inch. The pain was instantaneous and overwhelming, his vision immediately blurred by blood running into his eyes. But Chen's training took over even through the shock and pain. He could feel the aircraft beginning to roll left as Holloway's weight shifted against the controls. With his left hand, his good hand, he grabbed the yoke and pulled back, fighting to level the wings. His right arm was nearly useless, blood pouring from the deep laceration, but he forced it to move, reaching for the autopilot engage button. "Mayday, mayday, mayday." Chen managed to gasp into the radio, his voice distorted by pain and the wind now howling through the massive hole where the window had been. "Bagram approach, reach 447, we've had a catastrophic bird strike, multiple casualties in the cockpit, requesting immediate." His hand found the autopilot button, and he stabbed it desperately. The familiar hum of the autopilot engaging was the sweetest sound he'd ever heard. The aircraft stabilized immediately, the computer taking over the thousands of tiny control inputs needed to maintain level flight. Then Chen's vision began to tunnel. The blood loss was rapid, catastrophic. He could feel consciousness slipping away like water through his fingers. His last coherent thought was that at least the autopilot would hold them steady long enough for someone to figure out what to do. Then his hand slipped from the controls and he slumped in his seat, the world fading to gray and then to black. The howling wind through the shattered window was deafening, a constant scream that filled every inch of the aircraft. In the cargo hold, Maya felt the aircraft lurch violently, first the roll that Chen had arrested, then the sudden stabilization as the autopilot engaged. But something was wrong. She could hear it in the change of engine pitch, feel it in the way the aircraft was flying. The smooth, controlled flight had been replaced by something else. The aircraft was stable but felt wrong somehow, like a car driving itself down the highway with no one at the wheel. She unstrapped and moved forward, her loadmaster training screaming at her that something catastrophic had just happened. She'd felt bird strikes before, the thump of a bird hitting the fuselage or wings, but this had been different, louder, more violent. Then she saw Technical Sergeant Webb burst from the cockpit, and the expression on his face made her blood run cold. Webb was a veteran of 3 combat deployments, a man who'd seen engines catch fire, who'd flown through enemy fire, who'd dealt with every emergency the aircraft could throw at him. Maya had never seen fear on his face. Until now. "Get the medics up here now," Webb shouted, his voice cracking with urgency. "Both pilots are down. Move, move, move." Maya's heart stopped. Both pilots down. The words didn't make sense. Pilots didn't just go down, not both of them, not at the same time. She spun and shouted to the medical team, who were already unbuckling, grabbing their trauma bags with the practiced speed of professionals who knew that seconds could mean the difference between life and death. Sergeant First Class Williams and Captain Myers rushed forward into the cockpit, pushing past Webb. Maya followed close behind, and when she reached the cockpit doorway, she froze. The scene was a nightmare rendered in blood and broken plexiglass. The left cockpit window was simply gone, replaced by a jagged hole through which the wind screamed with hurricane force. Blood was everywhere, splattered across the instrument panels, dripping down the seats, pooled on the floor. Both pilots were slumped in their harnesses, Holloway completely unconscious, Chen's eyes half open but unfocused. The dead vulture lay in the cockpit footwell, its massive body broken and twisted, feathers everywhere. Shards of plexiglass covered every surface, glinting in the sunlight streaming through the destroyed window. Williams immediately went to work on Holloway, her hands moving with professional precision despite the chaos. She checked his pulse, present but weak, then began assessing his head wound. "Severe head trauma," she called out over the wind. "Possible depressed skull fracture. He's breathing but completely unresponsive. I need pressure bandages now." Captain Myers was working on Chen, tilting his head back to keep his airway clear as blood ran down his face. "Multiple deep lacerations, significant blood loss from the arm wound," Myers reported, his voice clinically detached despite the gore. "He's semi-conscious but fatting fast. Radial pulse is thready. We need to control this bleeding or he's going to bleed out in minutes." Webb was already at the flight engineer's station, his hands flying across the panel as he scanned instruments with frantic intensity. "Autopilot is holding, but we've got damage to multiple systems," he reported, his voice tight with controlled panic. "We're losing cabin pressure slowly through that hole. Engines are stable, fuel is good, but we've got 38 minutes before we need to be on the ground somewhere." Maya stood frozen in the doorway, unable to process what she was seeing. This couldn't be happening. Things like this didn't happen. They flew routine missions, transported cargo, landed safely. This was supposed to be a milk run. But the blood was real, the wind was real, the terror on Webb's face was real. Captain Holloway's eyes suddenly flickered open for just a moment. They were unfocused, glazed with pain and confusion, but there was something behind them, some last desperate attempt at consciousness. He tried to turn his head, tried to focus on something, someone. Blood ran down his face into his mouth. He coughed, spat blood, tried to speak. The words came out as barely more than a whisper, but they cut through the howling wind, through the chaos, through everything. Who can fly? The question hung in the air like a death sentence. Webb looked at Maya. The medics looked up from their patients. Everyone in that cockpit knew exactly what those 3 words meant. They had an aircraft full of people at 20,000 feet over some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. They had no qualified pilots. They had less than 40 minutes of fuel to find an airfield and get on the ground. The autopilot would hold them steady, but it wouldn't land them. Someone had to fly this aircraft. Someone had to take those controls and bring 23 souls home safe. But there was no one qualified, no one trained, no one who had any business sitting in that blood-spattered captain's seat, except maybe there was. Maya's mind raced through the possibilities in microseconds, each option more hopeless than the last. Webb was a flight engineer, brilliant with systems, could troubleshoot anything mechanical, but he'd never touched the flight controls. His job was managing engines and systems, not flying. The medics were combat medical specialists, with zero aviation training beyond how to buckle into a jump seat. The other loadmasters in the cargo hold were skilled at their jobs, but had never been anywhere near a cockpit except as passengers. No one aboard this aircraft had any business sitting in the captain's seat of a C-130, except the 2 men who were bleeding out in front of her. Except she had, once in a different life, 5 years ago. "I can fly." The words came out of her mouth before her brain fully processed them, escaping on pure instinct, driven by something deeper than conscious thought. Every head in the cockpit turned toward her with expressions ranging from shock to disbelief. Webb's eyes went wide, his face a mixture of confusion and desperate hope. "Tors, what are you? You're a loadmaster. You've never—" "I washed out of pilot training 5 years ago," Maya said, her voice steadier than she felt, even as her heart hammered so hard she thought it might burst through her chest. "Medical disqualification during T1 training, but I completed the entire T6 program. That's basic flight training. I finished about 60% of the total pilot training curriculum before I was grounded." She took a breath, forcing herself to speak clearly over the roaring wind. "I've got my civilian pilot's license. I've logged about 200 hours in the last 5 years, Cessna 172s, a few hours in a Piper Cherokee, some time in a Beechcraft Bonanza. And I've been studying C-130 systems since I became a loadmaster. I know this aircraft inside and out, the hydraulics, the engines, the flight controls, the avionics. I've never flown one, but I understand how it works." Webb stared at her like she'd grown a second head, his expression caught between hope and horror. "You never flew a C-130 in training. You never landed anything bigger than a 4-seater Cessna. Hell, you never even finished pilot training." "I know." Maya's voice cracked slightly, the enormity of what she was suggesting hitting her like a physical blow. "But I understand the principles. Lift, drag, thrust, weight, physics doesn't change with the size of the aircraft. I know the approach speeds, the landing procedures. I've watched hundreds of C-130 landings. I've studied the flight manual, and right now, Webb, I'm the only option we've got." Sergeant First Class Williams looked up from Captain Holloway, her hand still applying pressure to his head wound with a blood-soaked bandage. Her face was grim, professional, but Maya could see the fear in her eyes. "These men need a hospital in the next 30 minutes or they're going to die," Williams said flatly. "Holloway's got a depressed skull fracture, and he's showing signs of increased intracranial pressure. Chen's lost at least 2 pints of blood and counting. I don't care who's flying this aircraft as long as someone gets us on the ground. Fast." Captain Myers looked up from Chen, his assessment equally dire. "Agreed. We can keep them alive for maybe 45 minutes with what we've got here. After that, without a trauma surgeon, we're going to lose them both. Someone needs to fly. Now." Webb ran a hand over his face, his expression agonized. As the senior functional crew member with both pilots incapacitated, the decision fell to him. Trust a loadmaster with incomplete pilot training to land an aircraft she'd never flown, or try to talk someone through it over the radio with 0 flight experience. Some choice. Either option could kill everyone aboard. "How much of the training did you actually complete?" Webb asked, his voice tight with tension. "Be specific, Tors. I need to know exactly what you can and can't do." Maya forced herself to think clearly, to assess her actual capabilities honestly rather than what she wished she could do. "I completed all of initial flight training. That's the T6 Texan II program. 58 hours of flight time in the T6. I can handle basic aircraft control, takeoffs, climbs, descents, turns, stalls, recovery procedures. I did navigation flights, formation flying, night flying, instrument approaches. I washed out during T1 training before I got certified for heavy aircraft landings, but I completed the ground school for the T1. I understand multi-engine procedures, cockpit resource management, emergency protocols." She paused, then added the most important part. "I've never landed anything heavier than 3,000 pounds. A C-130 weighs about 75,000 pounds right now with cargo and fuel. I've never dealt with that much mass, that much momentum, but I've watched you and the pilots. I've studied the procedures. I've run the scenarios in my head 1,000 times. I know what needs to happen. I've never actually done it." It was insane. They both knew it was insane. The chances of her successfully landing this aircraft were probably less than 50%, maybe less than 30%. But what was the alternative? Webb looked at the 2 bleeding pilots, at the medics working frantically to keep them alive, at the blood-spattered instruments still showing them stable at 20,000 feet, because the autopilot was doing its job. He looked at the fuel gauges showing 36 minutes of flying time remaining. He looked back at Maya. "All right," he said finally, his voice barely audible over the screaming wind. "Get in that seat. I'll be your co-pilot and flight engineer. I'll manage the systems, the engines, the radios. You fly the aircraft. But Tors, if you don't think you can do this, if you have any doubt at all, you tell me right now. Don't lie to me, don't lie to yourself. Can you land this bird?" Maya looked past him at the instrument panel, at the yoke still making tiny movements as the autopilot maintained their course. She thought about every flight simulator she'd sat in during training, every hour she'd logged in civilian aircraft, every C-130 systems manual she'd studied just to feel closer to the dream she'd lost. She thought about the physics equations she'd memorized, the approach procedures she'd reviewed, the emergency checklists she'd read for an aircraft she'd never thought she'd actually fly. She thought about the 23 people aboard this aircraft, the 6 medics who'd trusted their lives to this crew, Webb who'd become like a brother to her, the 2 pilots who were dying because they'd been doing their jobs. She thought about all the people waiting for them at Chapman, depending on these medical supplies. She thought about the families back home who'd get the news if this aircraft went down. "I can do this," she said. She didn't know if it was true. She didn't know if she believed it herself. But she knew it was necessary. She knew that doubt and fear were luxuries she couldn't afford. She knew that someone had to try, and she was the only one who could. As Maya moved toward the captain's seat, she had to step carefully past Captain Myers, who was now working to stabilize Lieutenant Chen for transport. The co-pilot's eyes fluttered open for a moment, struggling to focus through the blood and pain. When he saw Maya, recognition flickered across his face. "Nighthawk," he mumbled through blood-stained lips, his voice barely a whisper. You got this, best stick in the squadron, just like training, you can do this." Then his eyes closed again and Myers cursed under his breath, immediately checking Chen's pulse and breathing. "He's fatting," Myers said urgently. "We need to move him back now. Williams, help me get him stabilized." Together, the two medics carefully extracted Chen from the right seat, supporting his head and injured arm as they maneuvered him out of the cockpit. Maya pressed herself against the bulkhead to give them room, watching as they carried the wounded co-pilot back to the cargo hold where they could lay him flat and work on him properly. Williams had already moved Holloway back there moments earlier. Both pilots now lay on the cargo floor, the medics working on them with desperate intensity, trying to stop bleeding, stabilize vital signs, keep two dying men alive long enough to reach help. Maya returned to the cockpit alone, and suddenly the space felt enormous and terrifyingly empty. She'd been in this cockpit dozens of times before, but always as a visitor, always with qualified pilots in these seats. Now, for the first time, she was alone up here. Alone with the controls, the responsibility, the impossible task ahead. She stood there for a moment, frozen by the enormity of it, her hand gripping the back of the captain's seat. The blood on the seat was still warm. She could see where fragments of plexiglass were embedded in the headrest. The wind howled through the shattered window with relentless fury, cold and loud and terrifying. "Tours," Webb's voice cut through her paralysis. He'd moved to the flight engineer's station and was already pulling up navigation data. "I know you're scared. Hell, I'm terrified. But those men back there are dying and we've got 34 minutes of fuel left. We need to move. Now." Maya took a deep breath, then another. She thought about all the times she'd sat in civilian aircraft, hands on the controls, feeling the machine respond to her inputs. She thought about her instructor's voice during pilot training. Flying is just managing energy. Height is potential energy. Speed is kinetic energy. Your job is to convert one to the other smoothly and deliberately. Do that, and everything else is just details. She slid into the captain's seat, and the world shifted into sharp focus. Maya slid into the captain's seat, and immediately the reality of what she was attempting hit her with crushing, almost physical force. The seat was still warm from Captain Holloway's body heat, a grotesque reminder of how quickly everything had gone wrong. Blood covered the left side of the instrument panel in dark streaks, some of it already drying to a rust-brown color. Shards of plexiglass glinted on the console, on the floor, embedded in the seats. The wind howling through the shattered window was deafening, disorienting, and bitterly cold at 20,000 feet, so cold that Maya's hands were already going numb. Her hands found the yoke, and she felt it trembling with the small, constant inputs the autopilot was making to keep them stable. The yoke was larger than anything she'd trained on, covered in switches and buttons she'd studied but never touched. It felt foreign and familiar at the same time, like meeting a person you'd only known through photographs. She'd never touched these controls before. Not once. Not in training, not in simulation. Everything she knew came from books, observations, mental rehearsals, and imagination. Webb dropped into the flight engineer's seat behind and between the two pilot positions, immediately beginning to scan gauges with frantic intensity. "Okay, first things first," he said, forcing his voice to remain calm and professional. "Don't touch anything yet. The autopilot is holding us steady at 20,000 feet, heading 270, speed 210 knots. We've got about 34 minutes of fuel remaining at current consumption. The nearest suitable airfield is Bagram. We just came from there, but it's our best option. Distance is about 80 nautical miles, which puts us at 42 minutes of flight time at this speed and altitude." Maya's stomach dropped like a stone. We don't have 42 minutes, we've got 34. We will if we optimize everything perfectly, Webb said, already pulling up navigation data on his display. We need to descend to a more fuel-efficient altitude, adjust our speed, fly the most direct route possible. But there's no margin for error. None. Not a single mistake, not one missed procedure. Everything has to be perfect. Maya felt her breathing accelerate, felt panic trying to claw its way up her throat. Perfect. She had to be perfect on her first attempt at flying an aircraft she'd never touched. I need to contact the tower. Webb pointed to the radio controls. Frequencies already set for Bagram approach. Just key the mic. Maya's fingers found the radio transmit button on the yoke. She pressed it, and for a moment her voice caught in her throat. What was she supposed to say? How did you tell an air traffic controller that you were attempting the impossible? Bagram Tower, this is Reach 447, declaring an emergency. Her voice came out surprisingly steady, almost calm, though inside she was screaming. We have both pilots incapacitated due to bird strike with multiple casualties aboard. We have an unqualified pilot at the controls and are requesting priority landing, full emergency response, and any assistance you can provide. There was a long pause on the other end, several seconds of dead air that felt like hours. Maya could imagine the chaos her words were causing in that tower, the controllers looking at each other in disbelief, trying to process what they'd just heard. Then, Reach 447, say again. Did you say unqualified pilot? Affirmative, Bagram. I'm a loadmaster, Staff Sergeant Maya Tours. I have incomplete pilot training. I washed out 5 years ago before certification. I've never landed a C-130. We have critical injuries aboard, limited fuel, and I need every bit of help you can give me. Another pause, longer this time. Maya could hear muffled voices in the background, people talking urgently, making decisions. Then a new voice came on, calm, professional, authoritative, female. A voice that carried the weight of experience and commanded immediate respect. Reach 447, this is Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Brennan, Squadron Operations Officer. I'm a C-130 instructor pilot with over 4,000 hours in type. I'm going to talk you through this step by step, and we're going to get you and your crew home safe. First, I need you to take a deep breath and tell me exactly what your experience level is. Don't minimize it, don't exaggerate it. I need the truth. There was something in that voice, a combination of competence and compassion, that cut through Maya's rising panic like a lifeline thrown to a drowning person. She took the breath Brennan had ordered, then another. Ma'am, I'm Staff Sergeant Maya Tours, call sign Nighthawk. I completed all of initial flight training in the T-6 Texan II, about 60 hours of flight time. I completed partial training in the T-1 Jayhawk before medical washout. I never got certified for heavy aircraft or multi-engine landings. I have a civilian pilot's license with approximately 200 hours logged in single-engine aircraft, mostly Cessna 172s, maximum gross weight around 2,500 pounds. I've never flown anything with 4 engines. I've never flown anything this heavy. I've studied C-130 systems extensively as part of my loadmaster duties, but I've never actually flown one. Okay, Maya, I'm Sarah. We're going to get you and your crew home safe. I promise you that. There was absolute conviction in Brennan's voice, as if failure wasn't even a possibility she'd considered. Now, here's what's going to happen. You're going to disengage that autopilot in a moment and hand fly this aircraft to Bagram while your flight engineer manages the systems. You're going to feel the weight of the aircraft when you take control. It's going to be heavier than anything you've ever flown, less responsive, more powerful. The controls will feel sluggish compared to what you're used to. Don't fight it. Small inputs, smooth movements. Think of it like driving a loaded semi-truck, not a sports car. Understand? Understood. Maya's mouth was desert dry. She tried to swallow but couldn't. Good. Now before you take control, I need you to do something for me. Look at the attitude indicator, the artificial horizon. Tell me what you see. Maya's eyes found the instrument, a circular display showing a miniature airplane against a horizon line. Wings level, slight nose-up attitude. The horizon line is about 2 degrees below the miniature aircraft. Perfect. When you disengage the autopilot, that's exactly what you want to maintain. Wings level, slight nose-up for level flight at this altitude. Your flight engineer is going to help you descend to a more fuel-efficient altitude in a moment, but first, you just need to feel the aircraft. Are you ready? Was she ready? No, she'd never be ready for this, but ready or not, it was happening. Webb, you ready? Maya asked, her voice tight. Webb's hands were already positioned on the engine controls, his eyes scanning the engine instruments. Born ready, tours. Just remember, small inputs. Don't overcorrect. The aircraft wants to fly straight and level. Your job is just to help it do what it already wants to do. Maya placed her right hand on the yoke, her left on the throttle quadrant. The controls felt solid, real, heavy with responsibility. Through the shattered window, she could see the mountains stretching endlessly in every direction, their peaks razor-sharp against the clear blue sky. Beautiful and deadly. One mistake and they'd be scattered across those peaks in 1,000 burning pieces. Disengaging autopilot in 3, 2, 1, now. She pressed the autopilot disconnect button and immediately felt the full weight of the aircraft transfer to her hands. The C-130 wallowed slightly as the autopilot released control, the nose dropping a few degrees before Maya corrected. Her heart leaped into her throat. She'd overcorrected, pulling back too hard, and the nose rose sharply above the horizon. Easy, Webb coached from behind her, his voice steady. You're okay. Small correction, just a tiny push forward. There you go. Maya pushed forward gently on the yoke and the nose dropped back to level flight. But her correction was too much again and the nose dropped below the horizon. She pulled back, overcorrected again. The aircraft was wallowing in a slow porpoising motion, nose up, nose down, nose up, nose down, as Maya fought to find the feel of the controls. It was like nothing she'd ever experienced. The controls were heavy, the aircraft's response delayed by what felt like several seconds. In the small aircraft she was used to, inputs were immediate, push forward, and the nose dropped instantly. But the C-130 was like moving a battleship. Everything happened in slow motion. Everything required anticipation and planning 3 steps ahead. You're doing fine, Sarah's voice came through the headset, calm and reassuring. What you're feeling is normal. The C-130 has a lot of mass and momentum. It doesn't want to change what it's doing quickly. Stop trying to correct every little deviation. Let the aircraft stabilize for a few seconds before making another input. Small corrections, then wait and see what happens. Maya forced herself to relax her grip on the yoke, to wait after each input. Slowly, gradually, the porpoising motion damped out. The attitude indicator showed wings level, the miniature aircraft sitting almost perfectly on the horizon line. There you go, Webb said. You've got it. Now just maintain that. Keep your eyes on the attitude indicator. Airspeed 210 knots. Altitude 20,000 feet. Heading 270. All stable. Maya's eyes flicked across the instruments, her training coming back in fragments and pieces. Airspeed indicator, altimeter, attitude indicator, heading indicator, vertical speed indicator. The six-pack of instruments that every pilot learned to scan in a continuous pattern, always moving, always checking, always staying ahead of the aircraft. She was flying, actually flying a C-130 Super Hercules. The realization hit her with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. Okay, Maya, you're doing great, Sarah said. Now we need to address the fuel situation. We're going to descend to 18,000 feet where the air is denser and the engines are more efficient. This is going to require coordination between you and your flight engineer. He's going to reduce power and you're going to establish a descent. Small nose down attitude. I want about 3 degrees nose down, which will give you roughly 500 feet per minute rate of descent. Your flight engineer will call out the numbers. Ready. Ready, Maya said, though she felt anything but. Webb's hands moved to the throttle levers, reducing power on all 4 engines by about 10%. Maya, give me a 3-degree nose-down attitude. Watch the VSI, the vertical speed indicator. I want to see 500 feet per minute descent rate. Maya pushed forward gently on the yoke. Too much. The nose dropped sharply, the VSI swinging to show 1,200 feet per minute descent. She pulled back, overcorrecting again, and the nose rose back above the horizon. Smaller, Webb said patiently. Much smaller inputs, like you're adjusting the temperature on a shower, tiny movements. Maya tried again, this time with barely perceptible forward pressure. The nose dropped gradually, smoothly, and the VSI needle moved to show 500 feet per minute down. There you go, Webb said. Hold that perfect. But as they descended, the cold mountain air flowing through the shattered window became absolutely brutal. Maya's hands were going numb on the controls despite her flight gloves, and she had to keep flexing her fingers to maintain feeling and grip. Her eyes were watering from the relentless wind, making it hard to read the instruments clearly. Her face felt frozen, her ears aching from the cold and the constant roar. This was going to be the longest 30 minutes of her life. If she even had 30 minutes, if the fuel lasted, if she didn't make a fatal mistake, if the damaged aircraft held together. Too many ifs, too many ways to fail. But failure wasn't an option. 23 people were counting on her. She had to succeed. She had to. At 18,000 feet, the turbulence returned with a vengeance that caught Maya completely off guard. The C-130 bucked violently as they descended into a layer of severe mountain wave activity, the aircraft dropping suddenly as if an invisible hand had shoved it downward, then just as quickly rising on a powerful updraft. Maya's stomach lurched with each jolt, and she fought desperately to keep the wings level. Stay on the gauges, Webb coached urgently. Don't look outside, trust your instruments, keep those wings level. Maya forced her eyes to stay locked on the attitude indicator, watching the miniature wings rock back and forth as the turbulence tried to roll the aircraft. Every instinct screamed at her to make large corrections, to fight the turbulence aggressively, but Webb's earlier advice echoed in her mind. Small inputs, smooth movements. She made tiny corrections with the yoke and rudder pedals, keeping the wings as close to level as she could manage. You're doing good, Sarah's voice came through the headset, steady as a rock. Mountain wave turbulence. It's going to be rough for the next few minutes, but the aircraft can handle far more than this. Just keep her steady. A particularly violent jolt slammed the aircraft sideways, and Maya felt the yoke try to twist out of her hands. She gripped tighter, her knuckles white, fighting to maintain control. Behind her, she could hear something sliding in the cargo hold, followed by a shout. She prayed it wasn't one of the injured pilots, prayed the medics had them secured properly. How are our patients? She called back through the intercom, her voice strained. Captain Meyer's voice came back tense and clipped. Holloway is still critical but stable for now. Chen's conscious again but very weak. The turbulence isn't helping. I'm worried about Holloway's head injury with all this bouncing around. How much longer until we're on the ground? Webb checked the navigation display, his expression grim. 28 minutes to Bagram, but Maya, we've got a problem. Maya's heart, already racing, kicked into an even higher gear. What kind of problem? Our fuel consumption is running higher than calculated. Webb was staring at the fuel flow gauges, his finger tracing across the numbers. The damage from the bird strike must have affected our aerodynamics. That hole in the cockpit is creating massive drag. We're burning fuel about 8% faster than optimal. Sarah's voice came immediately, sharp with concern. How much faster? Give me exact numbers. At current consumption rate, we've got maybe 26 minutes of fuel remaining, Webb reported. We need 28 minutes to reach Bagram. We're going to be cutting it extremely close, and that's assuming everything goes perfectly from here on out. Maya felt ice flood through her veins. Close meant they might not have enough fuel for a go-around, a second approach attempt if the first landing failed. They'd get exactly one chance to land this aircraft, or they'd be gliding a 75,000-pound machine into the mountains with no power, no options, and no hope. "We'll make it work," Sarah said firmly, though Maya could hear the tension beneath her professional calm. "Maya, I need you to start a very gentle descent. We're going to coast down gradually to save fuel. Every foot of altitude you give up now is potential energy you can convert to distance later. Webb, start giving her descent rates. We're going to fly the most fuel-efficient profile possible." For the next 15 minutes, Maya flew the most precise flight profile of her life. Webb called out speeds and descent rates with mathematical precision, and Maya followed his instructions to the letter, making tiny adjustments to maintain exactly the parameters he specified. Every degree of nose attitude mattered. Every knot of airspeed counted. Every foot of altitude was precious. The turbulence gradually lessened as they descended through 14,000 feet, and Maya felt her control of the aircraft becoming more natural, more intuitive. She was starting to feel the rhythm of it, understanding how the heavy transport wanted to fly, learning to anticipate its responses rather than just reacting to them. Her hands were still freezing from the wind through the broken window, but she'd learned to ignore the discomfort, to focus entirely on the instruments and the feel of the controls. Then at 12,000 feet, disaster struck again. The damaged cockpit window, which had been cracked and shattered but still partially intact in its frame, suddenly developed new fracture lines with a sharp cracking sound that cut through even the roar of the wind. Maya's eyes snapped to the window and watched in horror as spiderweb cracks spread across the remaining plexiglass like lightning frozen in ice. "Webb," Maya shouted, pointing at the spreading cracks with one hand while keeping the other locked on the yoke. Webb's face went completely white as he saw what was happening. Oh God! If that window fails completely at this altitude and airspeed, we could have explosive decompression. The pressure differential could rip the whole front section of the cockpit open. We'd lose control completely. "What do we do?" Maya's voice cracked with fear. "We need to depressurize the cabin gradually," Webb said, already reaching for the cabin pressure controls. "Equalize the pressure between inside and outside so there's no differential if that window fails completely. But it means we'll all be breathing thin air until we get lower. Everyone's going to feel it." Webb was already manipulating the pressurization controls, venting cabin pressure in a controlled manner. Maya felt her ears pop painfully as the pressure dropped. Within seconds, her head began to ache as the thinner air meant less oxygen reaching her brain. Breathing became noticeably more labored, each breath feeling like it wasn't quite enough. "Everyone in the back, we're depressurizing," Webb called through the intercom. "Get on supplemental oxygen if you need it. This is to prevent catastrophic structural failure." The cracks in the window continued spreading, a spiderweb of fractures growing before Maya's eyes like some kind of malevolent living thing. She could see through the cracks to the mountains below, and suddenly those mountains looked much closer than they should be, the rocky peaks sharp enough to tear metal apart. "Sarah, our situation just got worse," Maya reported, fighting to keep her voice steady. "The damaged window is failing and we've had to depressurize. I'm getting lightheaded." "Copy that. You're at 12,000 feet now. You should have enough oxygen to function, but it's going to be uncomfortable. Focus on your breathing, slow and deep, don't hyperventilate. Webb, how's she doing on the controls?" "Steady as a rock," Webb confirmed, and Maya could hear the pride in his voice despite the fear. "She's a natural, Sarah. If she survives this, the Air Force needs to put her through pilot training again." "When she survives this," Sarah corrected firmly. "Not if. When. Maya, you're doing everything right. 23 minutes from touchdown. I'm going to walk you through the landing checklist now while you've got time to think and prepare. When we get close, things are going to happen very fast and I need you ready for every step. Can you do that?" Maya's vision was slightly blurry from the altitude, the wind in her eyes, and the tears that kept forming from the brutal cold. But she gripped the yoke tighter and forced herself to focus. "I'm ready." As Sarah began walking through the landing procedures, gear extension at 1,000 feet, flap settings at different airspeeds, final approach speed of 130 knots, power management, flare technique, Maya repeated each item, committing them to memory. It was overwhelming. There were so many steps, so many things that had to happen in perfect sequence. Gear down and locked, flaps to approach setting then full, maintain airspeed, watch the glide path, manage the descent rate, flare at 50 feet. Deploy reversers after touchdown, maximum braking. One mistake in any of those steps could kill them all. "Sarah, I need to know something," Maya said during a brief pause in the checklist review. Her voice was quiet, almost lost in the wind. "If this doesn't work, if I can't land this aircraft, I need to know there's a backup plan for the people aboard." There was a long silence on the radio. Maya could almost feel Sarah choosing her words carefully. Then Sarah's voice came back, quieter than before, stripped of the instructor's professional confidence and replaced with simple human honesty. "Maya, there is no backup plan. You're going to land that aircraft because 23 people are counting on you and because you're capable of it. I've been listening to you fly for the last 20 minutes. You've got good hands, good instincts, good judgment. You're making the right decisions. You can do this. You're going to do this." Maya wanted to believe her. God, how desperately she wanted to believe her. But through the cracked, failing window, she could see the mountains passing below, peaks that could tear an aircraft apart in seconds, valleys filled with rocks and trees that would show no mercy to a crashing plane. She'd never felt so small, so inadequate, so terrified in her entire life. "Coming up on the Bagram corridor," Webb announced, his voice pulling her back to the present. 15 minutes to touchdown. Fuel is critical. We've got maybe 17 minutes remaining. We're going to make it, but just barely." 15 minutes. 15 minutes until she'd either pull off the impossible or kill everyone aboard. Her hands were shaking now, not from the cold or the thin air, but from pure, undiluted fear that was threatening to overwhelm every bit of training and determination she possessed. And then from the cargo hold, Captain Meyer's voice cut through on the intercom. "Tours. Captain Holloway just regained consciousness briefly. He's barely coherent, but he insisted I tell you something." A moment later, she heard Captain Holloway's voice, weak and slurred but carrying fierce determination despite his injuries. "Nighthawk, listen to me. You've got this. I've been watching you work for 6 months. Best natural stick I've ever seen. You were meant to fly. Trust yourself, trust your training. Bring them home." Then his voice faded as he lost consciousness again. But those few words, spoken by a man fighting through a skull fracture and severe concussion just to encourage her, changed everything. Maya's hands stopped shaking. The fear was still there, still a massive presence threatening to crush her, but underneath it something else emerged and grew stronger. Determination, purpose, resolve. She'd spent 5 years mourning the pilot she never got to be, 5 years feeling like a failure, 5 years wondering if she'd given up too easily when the medical board grounded her. Now, when it mattered most, when lives hung in the balance, she was going to prove that she'd been a pilot all along. The Air Force just hadn't known it yet. "Bagram in sight," Webb announced, 12 minutes out. Through the damaged window, Maya could see the airfield in the distance. A brown strip carved into the desert floor, looking impossibly small and impossibly far away. "All right," Maya said, her voice steady and calm and filled with quiet confidence that surprised even her. "Let's bring this bird home. Reach 447, you're cleared for straight and approach runway 03. Sarah's voice came through with absolute clarity now, the radio signal strong as they closed the distance to Bagram. "Winds are calm at 5 knots, visibility unlimited, ceiling and sky clear." You've got every emergency vehicle on base positioned along the runway, fire trucks, ambulances, crash rescue, the whole 9 yards. Half the base is watching this, Maya. Time to show them what Nighthawk can do. Maya began her descent toward Bagram, and with each 1,000 feet she lost, the ground rose to meet her with terrifying speed. The mountains that had seemed distant and abstract at 20,000 feet were now close enough to see individual rocks and trees. The desert floor that had been a vague brown expanse was now revealing details. Roads, buildings, vehicles that looked like toys from this altitude, but were growing larger with every passing second. At 8,000 feet, Webb began calling out the landing checklist items, his voice methodical and calm despite the tension radiating from every word. Landing gear. Maya's hand found the gear lever on her right side, a large T-shaped handle. She pulled it down, and immediately a grinding, rumbling sound reverberated through the entire aircraft as the massive landing gear began extending from the wheel wells. The nose gear deployed first, then the main gear, two massive assemblies, each carrying multiple wheels designed to support the 75,000-pound aircraft. 3 green lights appeared on the instrument panel, confirming all gear were down and locked. Gear down and locked, 3 green, Maya reported, her voice steady. Good, Sarah confirmed. You should feel the aircraft want to pitch nose down slightly as the gear creates drag. Don't fight it too much, just trim it out. You'll need to add a little power to maintain airspeed. Maya felt exactly what Sarah had described, the nose wanting to drop as the gear acted like giant speed brakes. She pulled back slightly on the yoke and nudged the throttles forward, feeling the 4 turboprop engines respond with increased power. The airspeed stabilized at 160 knots. Flaps to approach setting, Webb called out next. Maya's left hand found the flap lever and moved it to the first detent. She felt the aircraft shudder slightly as the wing flaps extended into the airstream, changing the wing's shape and creating more lift and more drag. The nose pitched down more aggressively, and the airspeed began to bleed off. Flaps approach, speed 160, Maya reported. She was having to make constant small adjustments now, throttle, yoke, rudder, keeping everything balanced and coordinated as the aircraft's flight characteristics changed with each configuration change. Looking good, Maya, Sarah coached. You're 5 miles out on glide path on speed. The runway is at your 12 o'clock straight ahead. Do you have it in sight? Through the cracked, damaged window, Maya could see it now, a long gray strip cutting through the brown desert, growing larger with every second. Runway in sight. Outstanding. Now comes the hardest part, just keeping it steady. Small corrections, stay ahead of the aircraft. You've got a slight crosswind from the right, so you'll need to crab into it slightly. Just a few degrees of heading correction to keep tracking straight toward the runway. But Maya was already feeling the crosswind pushing them left, and she was fighting it instinctively, applying right rudder and a slight bank to the right to compensate. It was exactly like the crosswind landing she'd practiced in the Cessna, just scaled up to an aircraft 30 times heavier. The physics were the same. The principles were identical. 4,000 feet 3 miles out, Webb called, his eyes locked on the instruments. Fuel is critical. We've got maybe 6 minutes remaining, descending through 4,000 feet. 6 minutes, and they needed at least 5 to get on the ground, maybe more if anything went wrong. No margin at all. Reduce speed to 140 knots, Webb instructed. Maya eased back on the throttles, feeling the aircraft slow, but as the speed decreased, the controls felt even more sluggish, even less responsive. Every correction took longer to take effect. The aircraft felt heavy, reluctant, like it was fighting her inputs. 3,000 feet 2 miles out, speed 140 on glide path. Flaps full, Webb commanded. Maya moved the flap lever to the full extension position, and the aircraft's entire character changed dramatically. The nose pitched up sharply, the deck angle increasing as the fully extended flaps created massive lift and drag. The rate of descent increased from 500 feet per minute to over 700 feet per minute. Maya's stomach lurched at the sudden change. Speed 130 knots. Rate of descent 700 feet per minute, Webb called out. Too fast on the descent, Sarah said immediately. You're coming down too steep. Add a touch of power, bring it back to 500 feet per minute. Maya's left hand pushed the throttles forward slightly. The 4 turboprop engines responded with a surge of power, and the descent rate decreased. But now her airspeed was increasing to 145 knots. She pulled back the throttles slightly. Now the descent rate increased again to 650 feet per minute. It was a constant, exhausting balancing act, throttle and pitch, each affecting the other, each requiring compensation. Too much power and they'd overshoot the runway threshold. Too little power and they'd hit short, slamming into the ground before the runway. Too fast and they wouldn't be able to stop. Too slow and they'd stall and drop like a stone. 2,000 feet, 1 mile out. Maya, you're high. You're above the glide path by about 50 feet. Maya's heart jumped. She was coming in too high. If she didn't correct, she'd overshoot the runway threshold and land long, maybe too long to stop the aircraft before running out of runway. At 75,000 pounds with all this momentum, they needed every foot of that runway. She pushed the nose down slightly, increasing the descent rate to 800 feet per minute, trying to get back on the correct glide path. That's too much descent, Webb said, real tension creeping into his voice for the first time. You're going to hit hard at that rate. I don't have a choice, Maya gritted out through clenched teeth. If I don't lose this altitude now, we'll land halfway down the runway and run off the end. I'd rather hit hard than not stop at all. Sarah's voice cut through the argument. She's right, Webb. Better to land hard and early than soft and long. Maya, you're making the right call. Keep that descent rate, but be ready to flare when I tell you. 1,000 feet, half-mile out. Landing checklist complete. All green lights. We're committed. Committed. The word hung in the air with terrible finality. They were too low, too slow, too close to abort now. They were landing on this runway whether Maya was ready or not, whether she could handle it or not. Through the window, Maya could see the runway clearly now. Every marking, every number, every crack in the concrete. She could see the emergency vehicles lined up along both sides, their lights flashing red and blue. She could see people standing near the vehicles, watching, waiting to see if she'd pull off the impossible or if they'd be scraping wreckage off the runway. 500 feet. Maya, you're still fast. Speed 145 should be 130. Maya's mind raced. Too fast meant they'd need more runway to stop. Every knot of excess speed meant hundreds of additional feet of runway consumed during the landing rollout. But if she tried to slow down now by pulling back power, she might stall. The stall speed with full flaps was around 105 knots, but with all this weight and the damaged aerodynamics from the broken window, who knew what the real stall speed was? She made her choice, keep the speed, accept the risk, hope for enough runway. I'm holding 145. We need the extra energy in case of wind shear or turbulence on short final. It was a lie. She was keeping the speed because she was terrified of stalling, but it sounded better to frame it as a tactical decision. 400 feet, 300 feet, start your flare, ease back on the yoke. Maya pulled back smoothly, bringing the nose up, trying to arrest their descent and transition from a controlled descent to level flight just above the runway. But she was still coming down fast, the ground rushing up at them with sickening speed. 200 feet, you're good, ease back more, flare Maya, flare. The runway was right there, filling her entire field of vision. She could see individual rocks on the ground beside the runway, could see people's faces as they watched from beside the emergency vehicles. She pulled back more on the yoke, feeling the nose come up, feeling the rate of descent decrease. 100 feet, looking good, hold that attitude. Maya's entire world had compressed to the view through that broken window, to the feel of the controls in her hands, to the rush of the runway markers flashing past below them. 50 feet, 40 feet, 30 feet. Ease back, flare now, pull back. Maya pulled back harder on the yoke, bringing the nose well above the horizon, trying to hold the aircraft off the runway for just a few more seconds, bleeding off speed, letting gravity pull them down gently. But she'd started the flare too late and pulled back too slowly. The main landing gear struck the runway with a tremendous, jarring bang that reverberated through every rivet and frame in the aircraft. It felt like they'd been hit by a giant hammer, the impact so violent that Maya's teeth clacked together and she bit her tongue. The taste of blood filled her mouth. The nose gear came down hard a second later with another violent impact that sent a shudder through the entire aircraft. Metal groaned. Something in the cargo hold crashed to the floor. Maya heard someone cry out in pain over the intercom. But they were down. They were on the ground. The hardest part was over. Except it wasn't. They were on the ground, but they were going fast, way too fast. The airspeed indicator showed 135 knots, almost 160 miles per hour. The runway markers were flying past in a blur. Reverse thrust, maximum braking, Webb shouted urgently. Do it now. Maya's hands flew to the throttle quadrant. She'd rehearsed this moment in her mind 100 times during the flight. She grabbed the 4 power levers and pulled them up and back into the reverse thrust range, feeling the detense click as the levers moved into position. The engine screamed in protest as the propeller blades changed pitch, directing their thrust forward instead of backward. The aircraft shuddered violently, the whole airframe vibrating like it was tearing itself apart. Maya felt like her teeth were going to rattle out of her skull. Her feet slammed down on the brake pedals with all her strength, every muscle in her legs straining. The anti-skid system immediately began chattering as it rapidly applied and released brake pressure to prevent the wheels from locking up and skidding. The C-130 began to decelerate, but not nearly fast enough. 6,000 feet of runway remaining, Webb called out, watching the runway distance markers flash past his window. 5,000, 4,000. They were eating up runway at an alarming rate. Maya pushed even harder on the brakes, feeling the pedals go nearly to the floor. The tires were screaming now, and she could smell burning rubber even through the wind still howling through the broken window. Smoke poured off the wheels in gray clouds. 3,000 feet. Maya were not going to stop in time. The end of the runway was visible now, growing larger in Maya's vision with horrifying speed. Beyond it, she could see the overrun area, a section of reinforced concrete designed to give aircraft extra stopping distance in emergencies. And beyond that, dirt, rocks, and the metal barrier that marked the absolute end of the airfield. If they hit that barrier at any significant speed, the aircraft would collapse like a crushed beer can. The fuel tanks would rupture. Fire would consume everything. 23 people would die because she'd come in too hot, too fast, too inexperienced. No, she hadn't come this far, hadn't fought this hard, hadn't overcome this much to fail now. Maya did something she'd never done in any aircraft, something that went beyond the procedures she'd memorized. She stood on the brakes with both feet, lifting herself partially out of the seat, using her entire body weight, pushing the pedals so hard her legs shook with the effort. She felt something in her right knee pop, a sharp pain that she immediately ignored. 2,000 feet, we're still going too fast. The anti-skid system was on the ragged edge of failure, the wheels right at the threshold of locking up completely. If they locked, the tires would blow and they'd start skidding uncontrollably. But Maya kept the pressure on, gambling everything on those brakes, holding just a few more seconds. 1,000 feet, we're slowing, it's going to be close. The numbers counted down in Maya's head like a countdown to execution. 800 feet, 600 feet, 400 feet. The C-130 was shuddering so violently that instruments were blurring, her vision shaking, but she didn't let up on the brakes for even a fraction of a second. 200 feet of runway remaining, 100 feet, 50 feet. And finally, with less than 800 feet of runway remaining, barely enough space to park 3 C-130s nose to tail, the aircraft came to a complete stop. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody even breathed. The only sounds were the clicking of cooling metal, the howling wind through the broken window, and the distant wail of emergency vehicle sirens racing toward them. Then Webb let out a whoop that could probably be heard back in Alabama. "Hot damn, Tors, you did it. You actually did it. You crazy, beautiful, magnificent pilot, you did it." Maya sat frozen in the captain's seat, her hands still gripping the yoke in a death grip so tight her fingers had gone completely white. Her feet were still pressed hard on the brakes even though the aircraft was motionless. She couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't process what had just happened. Her entire body was shaking uncontrollably, adrenaline flooding her system with nowhere to go. Through the window, she could see emergency vehicles surrounding them, dozens of people in flight suits and combat uniforms running toward the aircraft. The cargo ramp was already dropping open, and she could hear the emergency medical teams swarming aboard, racing to where Captain Holloway and Lieutenant Chen lay. "Maya," Webb's hand was on her shoulder, gentle but firm. "Maya, you need to let go of the controls. We're on the ground, we're safe. You can let go now." But Maya's hands wouldn't respond. Her fingers were locked around the yoke, muscles cramped from the death grip she'd maintained for the last 30 minutes. Webb had to physically pry her fingers open, one at a time, until finally her hands came free. She tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't support her. They'd turned to jelly, all the strength that had been holding her upright suddenly gone. She collapsed back into the seat, her vision tunneling, the cockpit spinning around her. "Get me a medic up here," Webb shouted. "Tors is going down." One of the emergency responders climbed into the cockpit moments later, a young Air Force paramedic who took one look at Maya and immediately began assessing her. "Ma'am, can you hear me? Can you tell me your name?" "Tors," Maya managed to gasp. "Staff Sergeant Maya Tors." Her chest felt tight, like iron bands were wrapped around her ribs. She couldn't get enough air, couldn't breathe deeply, couldn't fill her lungs no matter how hard she tried. "You're hyperventilating," the paramedic said calmly, professionally. He'd clearly seen this before. "What you're feeling is completely normal. It's an adrenaline crash after extreme stress. Just match my breathing, okay? In through your nose for 4 counts, hold for 4 counts, out through your mouth for 4 counts. Watch me. In 2, 3, 4. It took several minutes before Maya's breathing normalized and the shaking subsided enough for her to think clearly. The medic wanted to put her on a stretcher, standard procedure for anyone involved in an aircraft emergency, but she refused adamantly. She had to see her crew, had to know that everyone was really okay, had to confirm with her own eyes that the impossible thing she'd just done had actually worked. The medic finally relented, but insisted on staying close as Maya stumbled out of the cockpit and down the cargo ramp on unsteady legs. The scene on the tarmac was organized chaos that assaulted her senses. Captain Holloway and Lieutenant Chen were already being loaded into separate ambulances, medical teams working on them with practiced efficiency and urgent intensity. The 6 Army medics were standing nearby in a tight group, looking shaken but unharmed, their faces pale but their bodies whole. Specialist Rodriguez saw Maya first and immediately broke away from the group, running over and grabbing her in a fierce hug that nearly knocked her over. "You saved our lives. Holy shit, Nighthawk, you actually flew us home. You're a goddamn hero." The others crowded around instantly, all talking at once, hands reaching to pat her shoulders, voices overlapping in a cacophony of gratitude and disbelief and relief. Maya couldn't process any of it. She felt disconnected from her body, watching the scene from a distance like she was observing someone else's life. Then she saw Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Brennan pushing through the crowd. The woman who had talked her through the landing was shorter than Maya had imagined during those tense radio conversations. Maybe 5'6", around 40 years old, with gray-streaked brown hair pulled back in a tight bun, and the confident bearing of someone who'd spent decades in the cockpit. Her flight suit showed the wear of countless hours in the air, and her eyes were sharp, intelligent, kind. Sarah stopped in front of Maya, and for a moment they just looked at each other. Two pilots, separated by rank and experience but connected by the shared understanding of what had just happened in the sky. Then Sarah did something unexpected. She came to attention and rendered a sharp, perfect salute, a formal salute from a lieutenant colonel to a staff sergeant, which violated every protocol in the book but was clearly intentional and meaningful. "That was the gutsiest thing I've ever witnessed in 20 years of flying, Sergeant Torres," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly despite the chaos around them. "In 2 decades of aviation, through combat deployments, through training accidents, through every kind of emergency you can imagine, I have never seen anything like what you just did. You are a pilot, Maya, not because of any certificate or wings on your chest, but because of what you just proved in the air. You're a pilot in the truest, deepest sense of the word." Maya returned the salute shakily, her hand trembling as it moved to her forehead. "I couldn't have done it without you talking me through every step, ma'am. You saved us as much as I did." "Maybe," Sarah said, dropping the salute and extending her hand. Maya shook it, and Sarah's grip was firm, warm, real, grounding. "But I wasn't the one with my hands on the controls. I wasn't the one making life-or-death decisions every second. I wasn't the one who had to feel that aircraft, understand it, fly it with no training and no practice. That was all you." Sarah's expression softened slightly. "Come on, let's get you debriefed and checked out by medical. You've got a long day ahead of you still." The next few hours blurred together in an exhausting haze. Maya had to recount every detail of the flight multiple times to different officers, each one recording her statement for the official investigation that would inevitably follow. She was poked and prodded by doctors who declared her physically fine, except for a strained knee and some bruised ribs from her harness, but they recommended observation for shock and psychological trauma. Through it all, she kept asking about Holloway and Chen, but nobody seemed to have concrete answers. Finally, around 1900 hours, 7 in the evening, she got real information. Captain Holloway had been rushed into emergency surgery immediately upon arrival at the base hospital. He had a depressed skull fracture where the plexiglass fragment had struck him, along with severe concussion and significant brain swelling. The surgeons had to relieve the pressure on his brain, a delicate procedure that took over 4 hours, but the neurosurgeon was cautiously optimistic. Barring complications, Holloway should make a full recovery, though he'd need months of rehabilitation. Lieutenant Chen had required over 150 stitches for the multiple lacerations across his face and arm. He'd lost nearly 3 pints of blood, dangerously close to the threshold where survival becomes uncertain. But the rapid treatment by the Army medics during the flight, followed by immediate transfusions upon landing, had saved his life. He was stable, conscious, and expected to make a complete recovery, though his face would carry scars for the rest of his life. Both men would be medevaced to Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany within 24 hours for continued specialized care. When Maya finally made it back to her quarters around 2200 hours, she thought she'd collapse immediately into bed and sleep for a week. Her body was exhausted beyond anything she'd ever experienced, every muscle aching, her hands still trembling with residual adrenaline. But when she lay down and closed her eyes, sleep wouldn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the blood-spattered cockpit, felt the yoke heavy and unresponsive in her hands, saw the runway rushing up to meet them too fast, too steep, heard the sickening bang of the hard landing, felt the terror of watching the end of the runway approach while they were still going too fast to stop. She kept replaying every decision, every input, every moment. Had she started her descent too early? Should she have come in slower despite the risk of stalling? Could she have landed softer? Should she have deployed the reversers sooner? Was the hard landing her fault? Had she damaged the aircraft with her inexperience? Had she hurt anyone with that violent touchdown? The what-ifs and second-guessing spiraled endlessly through her mind, giving her no peace. Around midnight, there was a knock on her door. She opened it to find Technical Sergeant Webb standing there with 2 cups of coffee from the all-night galley, still in his flight suit, looking as exhausted and wired as she felt. "Figured you couldn't sleep either," he said simply. They sat outside her quarters on a concrete bench, drinking the coffee and watching the distant lights of aircraft taking off and landing. The normal rhythm of the base continuing despite the extraordinary thing that had happened that afternoon. Life going on. "You know," Webb said after a long silence, staring into his coffee cup like it held answers to questions he hadn't asked yet. "I've been flying for 15 years. 3 combat deployments, over 3,000 hours in the air, been through more emergencies than I can count on both hands. Engine failures, hydraulic problems, electrical fires, ground fire, you name it. But I've never, and I mean never, seen anything like what you did today. Most pilots with thousands of hours would have crashed that aircraft. Hell, most pilots wouldn't have even tried. They would have frozen up, panicked, given up. You brought it home on your first try." "I almost killed everyone," Maya said quietly, her voice hollow. "We came in too fast, too high. That landing was terrible. I hit so hard I probably damaged the landing gear. I nearly ran us off the end of the runway. If there had been 500 fewer feet of concrete, we'd all be dead right now." Webb turned to look at her, his expression serious. "Nearly doesn't count in aviation tours. You know what counts? The outcome. And the outcome is that 23 people are alive right now who should be dead. Captain Holloway is in surgery instead of scattered across a mountain. Chen is getting stitched up instead of being zipped into a body bag. Those 6 medics are calling their families to tell them they're okay instead of their families getting visits from casualty notification officers. That's what counts." He paused, then added more softly, "You made mistakes. Of course you did. You'd never flown that aircraft before. But you also made 100 correct decisions under impossible pressure with incomplete training and no room for error. You adapted, you learned on the fly, you kept your head when most people would have lost it. That's what separates real pilots from people who just happen to have licenses." Maya wanted to believe him. She wanted to accept that she'd done well, that she'd succeeded, that she had something to be proud of. But all she could feel was the lingering terror and the crushing weight of how close they'd come to disaster. "Get some rest, Tors," Webb said, standing up and draining the last of his coffee. "Tomorrow's going to be intense. The wing commander wants to see you. There'll be more debriefings, probably some people from Air Force Safety. And," he paused, a slight smile crossing his tired face, "you're probably going to get a medal. They don't give loadmasters the Distinguished Flying Cross for nothing." After he left, Maya sat alone for a while longer, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead. The same stars that had looked down on her desperate flight, on her terror, on her triumph. They seemed different now somehow, though she couldn't articulate why. 2 weeks later, Maya stood at attention in a ceremony hangar at Bagram Air Base. The space was packed with what seemed like half the base. Her entire squadron, the Army medical team she'd saved, crews from other units who'd heard the story that had spread like wildfire through the base and beyond, even some brass from headquarters who'd flown in specifically for the ceremony. At the front of the hangar sat Captain Derek Holloway in a wheelchair, his head still heavily bandaged but his eyes clear and focused for the first time since the accident. Lieutenant James Chen stood beside him in his dress uniform, the right side of his face still showing the angry red scars from the lacerations, but healing well. Both men had insisted on being present despite their injuries, had fought their doctors and signed waivers to be here. The base commander, a 2-star general with 30 years of service, stepped forward with a blue velvet box in his hands. Inside, Maya could see the distinctive medal, the Distinguished Flying Cross, one of the highest honors the Air Force could award for extraordinary achievement in aerial flight. Staff Sergeant Maya Torres, the general's voice carried through the silent hangar with commanding authority, for heroism and extraordinary achievement while participating in aerial flight on July 15, 2024. When both pilots of your aircraft were incapacitated due to catastrophic bird strike, you voluntarily assumed control of the aircraft despite incomplete pilot training and no qualification in type. Over the next 35 minutes, you demonstrated exceptional airmanship, judgment, and courage under conditions that would have overwhelmed most pilots with far more experience. Through precise aircraft control and sound decision-making, you successfully landed a severely damaged C-130J Super Hercules, directly saving 23 lives and preserving a valuable military asset. Your actions reflect the highest credit upon yourself and the United States Air Force. It is my honor to present you with the Distinguished Flying Cross. As he pinned the medal on her uniform, the hangar erupted in thunderous applause. Maya stood rigid at attention, overwhelmed by the moment, fighting to maintain her military bearing even as tears threatened to fall. This wasn't supposed to be her story. She was supposed to be the pilot who washed out the dream that died, the what might have been. Not this. Not a hero. Not someone who saved lives. But the weight of the medal on her chest said otherwise. The ceremony wasn't over. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Brennan stepped forward next, carrying a different kind of package, a leather flight jacket, clearly new, the leather still stiff and unmarked by wear. "Sergeant Torres," Sarah said, and Maya could hear genuine emotion beneath her professional tone. "There's another matter we need to address. When you landed that C-130, you earned something that no amount of training could ever give you, the unqualified respect of every pilot who's ever sat in a cockpit. You proved beyond any shadow of doubt that you belong in the sky, that you were always meant to fly." Sarah unfolded the jacket, and Maya could see patches carefully sewn onto it. The squadron patch on one shoulder, Air Force wings on the other, and over the left breast, a name patch reading TORRES with Nighthawk embroidered below it in bold letters. "This call sign was given to you years ago during your initial pilot training," Sarah continued. "Today, it becomes your official call sign as a rated pilot in the United States Air Force. Because as of 600 hours this morning, based on my recommendation and the endorsement of every senior pilot in this theater, your medical waiver has been approved by Air Force Personnel Command, and you have been officially reinstated into undergraduate pilot training." The applause grew even louder, people cheering now. Maya's breath caught in her throat. The dream she'd mourned for 5 years, the career path she'd accepted was forever closed, was suddenly open again. They were giving her a second chance. "Furthermore," Sarah said, raising her voice to be heard over the noise, "I have submitted a request to be your primary instructor when you return to flight school. I want to be there when you get your wings. The real ones. The ones you've already earned but haven't been officially awarded yet." Now Maya couldn't stop the tears. They ran freely down her face as Sarah helped her into the flight jacket, the leather settling onto her shoulders with a weight that felt like destiny finally catching up to where she was supposed to be. Then Captain Holloway wheeled himself forward. It took tremendous effort for him to stand, and Lieutenant Chen had to help support him, but he straightened to his full height despite the obvious pain it caused. "Nighthawk," he said, his voice still slightly slurred from the head injury but strong with conviction and emotion. "You saved my life. You saved all our lives. I told you in that cockpit that you had the best natural stick I'd ever seen, and I meant every word. I've flown with hundreds of pilots over my career, experienced aviators, combat veterans, people with thousands of hours. And what you did with 0 time and type under those conditions scared out of your mind. It's the most impressive flying I've ever witnessed." He extended his hand and Maya took it, gripping tight. "Thank you, sir," she managed to say through her tears. "Thank you for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself." Always, Holloway replied. Then he grinned despite the obvious discomfort from his injuries. Just promise me one thing. Next time you're flying, make sure I'm safely on the ground watching, not bleeding in the back of your aircraft, okay? The tension broke, and everyone laughed, the sound washing over Maya like a wave of acceptance and belonging. After the ceremony, there was a reception with food and drinks, people wanting to shake her hand, hear the story firsthand, take photos with the hero of Bagram. Maya endured it for about an hour before the overwhelming attention became too much. She needed space, needed air, needed to process everything that had happened. She slipped away and found herself walking to the flight line, where a C-130 was being prepped for an evening cargo mission. She stood there in her new flight jacket, the distinguished flying cross on her chest, watching the crew perform the same pre-flight inspection she'd done thousands of times as a loadmaster. The crew chief noticed her and walked over, recognition dawning on his face. "You're Nighthawk, right? Tours. Hell of a thing you did, ma'am. The whole base has been talking about nothing else for 2 weeks." "Just got lucky," Maya said automatically. Chief, a grizzled master sergeant who looked like he'd been working on aircraft since before Maya was born, shook his head firmly. "Ma'am, with all due respect, that's bullshit. I've been turning wrenches on these birds for 23 years. I've seen lucky landings and I've seen skilled landings. What you did wasn't luck. That was pure pilot skill and determination. That aircraft should have crashed. The aerodynamics were all wrong with that massive hole in the cockpit. Fuel was critical. You had no time in type. But you wouldn't let it crash. You willed that bird onto the runway through skill and sheer force of personality." He paused, studying her face. "Can I ask you something personal, ma'am?" "Sure." "When you were up there with both pilots down and that aircraft falling out of the sky, were you scared?" Maya thought about the question, about the terror that had gripped her in those moments, about the fear that had nearly paralyzed her. "Terrified," she admitted honestly. "Every single second of it. I've never been more scared in my entire life." The chief nodded slowly, understanding in his eyes. "That's what makes you a real pilot, ma'am. Not the wings on your chest or the hours in your logbook or even that medal you're wearing. It's being absolutely terrified but flying anyway because people are counting on you. That's the difference between someone who flies and someone who's a pilot." He saluted, another technically incorrect salute from enlisted to enlisted, but meaningful nonetheless, and walked back to his aircraft, leaving Maya alone with her thoughts. She stood there as the sun set, painting the Afghan sky in brilliant oranges and purples, watching the C-130 taxi out for its mission. And for the first time since the emergency landing, she felt something other than fear and doubt and second-guessing. She felt peace. She felt right. She felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. 6 months later, Maya stood in a different hangar at Columbus Air Force Base, Mississippi, back where her original dream had died 5 years earlier. She was in her class, a dress uniform, the distinguished flying cross prominently displayed above her other ribbons, her hair perfectly arranged, her shoes polished to a mirror shine. The flight school commander stood at the podium, addressing the graduating class of pilot trainees. Maya's class. The class she'd finally completed after returning to finish what she'd started. "And in conclusion," the commander said, his voice carrying through the assembled crowd of families, instructors, and fellow students, "I want to recognize one member of this class whose journey to this moment has been extraordinary. Second Lieutenant Maya Tours washed out of this very program 5 years ago due to circumstances beyond her control, but she didn't let that define her. She didn't let it stop her from serving, from learning, from growing, from staying connected to aviation in any way she could." Maya stood as her name was called, walking to the front where the commander waited with the silver pilot's wings she'd dreamed about for so many years, the wings that represented everything she'd lost and fought to regain. "And then," the commander continued, "when the moment came that tested everything she'd learned, every skill she'd developed, every ounce of courage and determination she possessed, she rose to meet it in a way that has become legendary in Air Force aviation. Lieutenant Torres, it is my profound honor to award you these wings. You earned them in the hardest way possible, in blood and fear and impossible choices at 22,000 feet over Afghanistan. Today, we're just making it official. Welcome to the Brotherhood of Pilots. He pinned the wings over her heart, stepped back, and rendered a crisp salute. Maya returned it, then turned to face her classmates and the audience beyond. In the front row, she saw Technical Sergeant Webb, who'd taken leave to be here, wiping tears from his eyes unashamedly. She saw the 6 Army medics from that flight, Rodriguez, Williams, Myers, and the others, all grinning and applauding thunderously. She saw Sarah Brennan, her instructor throughout this second attempt at pilot training, standing proud and beaming. And she saw Captain Derek Holloway, fully recovered now and back on active flying status, standing at attention in his dress uniform. Lieutenant James Chen stood beside him, the scars on his face now faded to thin white lines but still visible, still a permanent reminder of that day. When Maya's eyes met theirs, both men smiled and saluted together, a gesture of respect from fellow pilots to one who'd proven herself in the crucible of emergency. After the ceremony ended and the formal photographs were taken, Maya found herself surrounded by well-wishers again, but this time it felt different. These weren't people amazed by what she'd survived. These were fellow pilots welcoming her to their ranks as an equal. Sarah pulled her aside when the crowd thinned. "So," she said with a knowing smile, "I hear you've been offered a position as a C-130 instructor pilot at Little Rock Air Force Base. That's where we train new C-130 pilots fresh out of flight school. It's a prestigious assignment for a brand new pilot." Maya nodded, still trying to process the opportunity. They said my experience with emergency procedures and systems knowledge would make me valuable for teaching students, but I just got my wings today. Becoming an instructor seems premature. "Are you kidding?" Sarah laughed. "Maya, you've got more real-world C-130 experience in the worst possible conditions than most pilots accumulate in years of normal flying. You know what it takes to fly when everything goes wrong, when all the procedures break down, when it's just you and the aircraft and your skill. That's exactly what students need to learn." She paused, her expression becoming more serious. "I've also been assigned to Little Rock. We'll be working together, training the next generation of cargo pilots, teaching them not just how to fly but how to handle the moments when everything falls apart. Sound good?" "Sounds perfect," Maya said honestly. Her phone buzzed with a text. It was from Captain Holloway. "Heard through the grapevine you're going to Little Rock. Guess what? Just got my orders. I'm being assigned there too as a standardization and evaluation pilot. Looks like I'll be flying with Nighthawk after all. Try not to scare me this time." Maya laughed and typed back, "No promises, sir." Another text arrived, this one from Chen. "Congratulations, Lieutenant. Still can't believe the loadmaster who saved my life is now going to be an instructor pilot. The irony is not lost on me. First round of drinks is on me when you get to Arkansas. You've earned it about 1,000 times over." As the sun set over Columbus Air Force Base, Maya walked to the flight line one last time as a student. A T-6 Texan II sat on the ramp, the same type of aircraft she'd flown during her first attempt at pilot training, the aircraft she'd excelled in before her medical washout. She walked around it slowly, running her hand along the fuselage just like she'd done with the C-130 that morning at Bagram so many months ago. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a message in the squadron group chat from one of her classmates. "Nighthawk flies tonight." She smiled, touching the silver wings on her chest, wings she'd earned twice, once in the traditional way through study and skill and determination, and once before that in blood and terror and impossible choices. Both times counted. Both times mattered. Both times had proven the same essential truth. Maya Torres wasn't someone who'd almost been a pilot. She wasn't someone who'd washed out and gotten a second chance. She wasn't defined by failure and redemption. She was a pilot, had always been a pilot, would always be a pilot. The Air Force just hadn't known it yet that morning when she'd climbed aboard a routine cargo flight to Forward Operating Base Chapman. But when Captain Holloway had asked that desperate question, "Who can fly?" and she'd answered, "Call sign Nighthawk," everything had changed. Not because she'd suddenly become something she wasn't before, but because she'd finally proven to the world what she'd always known in her heart. She belonged in the sky, and now, finally, officially, permanently, she had the wings to prove it. Second Lieutenant Maya, Nighthawk Tours, put on her flight jacket, walked to her car, and drove away from Columbus Air Force Base for the last time as a student. In 3 weeks, she'd report to Little Rock Air Force Base to begin her new assignment as a C-130 instructor pilot. She'd teach students how to fly, how to handle emergencies, how to stay calm when everything goes wrong, how to make impossible decisions under crushing pressure, how to bring their crews home safe no matter what. And sometimes, when students doubted themselves, when they thought they couldn't handle the aircraft or the responsibility or the weight of lives depending on them, she'd tell them about a loadmaster who'd never flown a C-130 before, who took the controls when both pilots went down, who landed 75,000 pounds of damaged aircraft with 23 souls aboard on her first try because there was no other choice. She'd tell them that when the moment comes, when someone asks who can fly, and everyone is counting on you, you find out what you're really made of. And she'd tell them that the answer is always the same. You can, you will, because you're a pilot. That's what the wings mean.